Hello, hope you're doing well today. I wanted to continue on our discussion about the Roman Republic, and this time to talk about the government, politics, and some of the things that have to do with that in the Roman Republic. As we had mentioned before, there were two social classes of people, patricians and plebeians. These are originally based upon birthright and will come, of course, patricians are wealthier, plebeians are in more poverty. But it's more than that, it's also a birthright. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of struggle between them. That struggle is really going to be one of the main issues during this time of the Roman Republic. Well, the Republic, of course, is dominated by the patricians, who are aristocrats, who are wealthy. They control the government, they control business, legislation, and basically just about anything they wanted to control. Plebeians, however, are going to be able to gain some rights, and eventually quite a few rights, really, certainly by the time you get to the late Republic period. How could they achieve this? Well, part of it is through social troubles, protests to lead to change. They basically said this isn't fair, that we be excluded, and they would protest to that effect. That does have some effect, no doubt. Also, there's changes in society which will allow this to happen. Eventually, this will mean that the Constitution of Rome will be changed, and it will allow for the plebeians to have a much bigger say in what's going on in the government and therefore in the everyday lives of people. For example, one of the things that happens is the establishment eventually of an office called tribune. Tribune was an office that was exclusively for plebeians, at first given as a kind of, I suppose you might say, figurehead. Let's give these plebeians some office so they can speak their minds, and that will appease them, but we don't give them real power. Of course, eventually that will change. To understand some of the politics of Roman Republic and later on, of course, the legacy to the Roman Empire, we need to understand the Cursus Honorium, or the course, the pathway to honor. So I want to list now a few of the many offices that has to do with the Cursus Honorium. Your textbook talks about this as well. At the very top of this political realm are the councils. There are two councils, and the councils are elected annually. The Romans wanted to have two councils because they wanted to avoid having a king. And of course, having one council, one person in charge, gives, well, at least a chance of one person taking control. And the Romans did not want a king. Now, I suppose you might find that ironic, given the fact that when most people think of the Romans, they think of emperors, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and so forth. But at first, the Romans were quite adamant that they did not want one person in charge, so they had two councils. So we're in election year. Instead of having one president, we'd have two. Can you imagine the political ramifications of having two chief executives who then must agree or compromise on all these things? So you can imagine it was not it's not efficient, I guess. Dictatorships are very efficient. That's why I always tell people democracy is not efficient. Some people complain, well, Washington doesn't get a lot of stuff done. They debate a lot of things. They don't get a lot of things done. Well, really, by design, democracy is messy and not efficient. The Romans didn't want a very efficient government here, certainly at the very top. So they had two councils that they elected annually. Now this name council then will go on down, and we will find it used, for example, in France with Napoleon and so forth, and in other ramifications. Well, the councils had imperium. Imperium is where we get the root of the word empire and imperial. Imperium means power. I suppose very specifically it means the power to command an army, conduct military activity, but in general it means they had all the power. Of course, they shared it between the two of them. Again, as we said, power to command an army, two councils to avoid ever having a king again. Now, there were times, as I said, having two leaders was not efficient. And so the Romans then established a dictatorship. Now, for us, the word dictator is always negative. I don't think, if somebody comes up to you and says you're a real dictator or something to that effect, you would take that as a compliment. Maybe some of you would. I won't name any names. But dictator, we generally have a negative idea about that, autocratic rule. But the Romans recognized, and they didn't see dictator as a negative word at that time. It was a necessary, something that was necessary in times especially of an emergency. If there is a fire in a building, you don't want people to sit down and have a meeting about which is the best route to get out of the building or who should call or whatever. You got to have somebody who takes charge, somebody who gets people to safety, some people that try to put out the fire, that sort of thing. It's the same way during war and other things like this. So a dictator then was necessary during an emergency. Now another office just below council, and maybe I should have done them from the bottom up, but I'm starting from the top down. Praetor. Praetor are judges. This would be, if the councils is the chief executive officer, praetors would be the chief judicial officer. At first there were two judges. They always wanted multiples. They didn't want one single person. But of course, as the Roman Republic grew, the territory grew, and so on, the numbers of judges would also increase. Quaestor. Quaestor is an office, we might call that person, depends on the government, minister of finance, that sort of thing. They controlled the money, the budgets, the pay, and so forth. All these things were controlled through the office of Quaestor. Now, by the way, when we call this a Cursus Honorium, it's a course, it's a pathway to honor. Typically, in American politics, I say typically, we don't see someone going for the highest office in the land without having served in lower offices. Although we have no law against it. I think we have a candidate this year running for president, if I'm not mistaken. This candidate has never held a political office, but is running for the chief office of the land. See, this is highly unusual. It never happened during the Roman period. You would have to work your way up, much like climbing steps on a ladder. You don't jump from the bottom all the way to the top. You have to climb up the rungs in between. So that's what the Cursus Honorium is. It's your pathway to honor. So you don't start off being consul. It's not going to happen. Or even praetor. You're going to work your way up through these various offices. Another office on your way up would be aedile. Aedile is a very important office, although rather expensive, and could open yourself up to some criticism. Although if you use it the right way, it could get you a lot of good publicity. Aedile is someone who makes sure the city of Rome, in particular, has enough grain to feed everybody. And they're also in charge of entertainment, things like chariot races, gladiatorial bouts, that sort of thing. And this could be a real crowd pleaser if you had enough money and enough clout. You could bring some really big and exciting entertainment into town, hand out a lot of free bread, and circuses would get your name well known and help you move up the line here. So aedile. They also had censors. Again, 2 censors. This is where we get our word for census. We still have a census. For us, it's every 10 years. For them, it was every 4 years. So coming up, what is this, 2016 and 2020, we will have another census. We just had one in 2010, so it'll be every 10 years, like clockwork. This becomes, for us in American political life, very political, because it allows a lot of shifting of things. You know, it allows for political maneuvering every time you have a census. Whoever's in charge, say, of the state, who's the governor, who controls the state legislature, when that new census information comes in, they can use that to redraw political lines to their advantage. Well, probably to their advantage, right? Not to their disadvantage. And so we use it that way politically. Also, the census, obviously, I usually ask students, what's a census for? Well, it's to find out how many people we have. Well, yeah, I suppose. But to be quite honest, the census is really to find out how much tax money we can get. Make sure everybody's paying taxes. Maybe to think up creative ways to get new tax money. Several years ago now, so I'm hoping the statutes of limitation are behind me on this. It might have been, it was not the 2000, it might have been the 1990 census. Could have been? Maybe. That's a long time ago. So I suppose they're still not looking for me. But, you know, I received a census thing. I was a poor graduate student. Not much has changed. Now I'm just a poor college professor. But I was a poor graduate student at the time. I lived in an efficiency apartment. It was basically one room, a one-room apartment. And as you know, I travel often in the summers, and I was away in 1990 in the Middle East excavating. Well, that was the summer of the census. And what they do is they hire, in the United States, they hire a lot of temporary workers, pay them, I guess, fairly decent wage. But their job is to go out and get census information. Not everybody wants to give the census information. I received in the mail a census form. It was addressed to me, and it was sent to my address there at that little apartment. When I received it, it was a voluminous document. You would think a census, they would know my name, maybe my age, where I live, a few other things. But this had page after page asking me how large, place did I live in, how many outlets did I have in the house, in the apartment, what sort of appliance did I have, and on and on and on. And I thought to myself, you know what? I don't think they need to know this. They already know my name. They know where I live. They have the basic information on me. I pay my taxes every year. I am not filling out this detailed form. So I just did not do it. I broke the law. I didn't do it. And since I was leaving the country for an extended period of time, which I did, I was able to escape the wrath, I guess, of the census workers, because by the time I got back, they were off the payroll and they weren't going to come on their own time and bother me. So I never did fill out that form, just to let you know. But the census is really about taxes. Make no mistake. It's about getting money from you. As I always tell people, even if they don't want to hear it, taxes, governments only get money one way, and that's from taxes. Everybody says, let's the government pay for things. The government will pay for this, and the government will pay for that. Well, to be quite honest, the government has no money. They only get money from taking it from the citizens. That's you and me. So if we want the government to pay for more things, then we're going to pay more to the government and then have the government pay it. So you can have your own views, but in my opinion, I'd rather hang on to what I have and pay for my own things and try to keep the government from taking all my money. Well, anyway, that's what the census is about. Where did we get it? We didn't invent that idea. The Romans invented the idea of the census. They did it every 4 years. Now, above this Cursus Honorium, after you had gone through the Cursus Honorium, and probably had even been a council, you could be elevated to the level of Senate. Now, you could become a senator. Now, what confuses, I think, a lot of people is here in the United States, you can run for the office of Senate. You're elected for 6 years. You can be reelected and so forth. That's not the way it worked in ancient Rome. You were appointed to be a senator. And at first, it was only the patrician class. It was 300 senators. And they served for life. So it's a little more, I guess, like the Supreme Court in that you are appointed and then you serve for life. Although you're not being a judge, you're sort of the ultimate political office is Senate. This is what most people who really wanted to achieve political clout is what they dreamed of. Now, at first, only patricians. Later on, plebeians could do it as well. All right, let's talk about some other things. We've talked about these offices, but there are also important assemblies. The assemblies gave people a way to voice their opinions and to have a voice, even though at first some of them, the voice was not really binding on anybody. The first assembly was called the Comitia Curiata, and this was a committee by which, or assembly by which, you were a part of by birth, and you voted by tribe. So that means that one tribe basically got one vote. So you may have a lot of people in your group, but you get one vote. This is dominated by the patricians and will decline after the Republic forms. So this is very early on, even before the beginning of the Roman Republic. By the middle of the 5th century BC, that is, we will see that they established a new assembly, the Comitia Centurion. This was based upon wealth. And in so doing, instead of being based upon birth, it's based upon wealth. So this reduced some of the control of patricians. And also here in the United States, we are accustomed to having everything based upon wealth, to be quite honestly. We wouldn't want to put it that way. To be quite honest, though, it is. So, for example, regardless of my birth, now, of course, we do have some families which are some called royalty or something, like a Kennedy's or something, the Kennedy family. Maybe some would say the Bush family. If you're born into this family, you're going to have some political clout and power. But it's really not the same. But nonetheless, for us, it's wealth. So that means you could start off, as my mother used to say, we were dirt poor. You could start off dirt poor, and you could change that situation simply by getting more money, right? So you go out and win the lottery, as I know all of you guys play the lottery over at the Love's Truck Stop. You could go over to the Love's Truck Stop and buy yourself some lotto tickets. Seemed like every time I went in there and I actually went inside to buy something, I always tried to avoid it. I would get behind people who would buy the lottery tickets. And that's all right. They want to buy the lottery tickets. That's up to them. But then they would buy the lottery. Let's say they buy 5 lottery tickets. The guy then would not get out of line. He would stand there right in line. He would rub the lottery tickets, rub off the stuff. Maybe he'd win, I don't know, $2 or something, $3 on one of these things. So what did he do? Did he pocket the money, go out happy? No. He'd say, okay, give me 2 or 3 more lottery tickets. And then he would stand. So this guy would come in with $10, and he would make sure that when he left, he had no money. At least that was the way I read it. He'd buy 10 tickets, he'd win $5. He'd buy 5 more tickets, he'd win $2. He'd buy 2 more tickets, he'd win nothing. Then he'd finally leave. So to be honest, I wasn't rooting for him when I was behind him in line. I guess I should have been, but I wasn't. I don't think he would have shared anyway. But you could go in there and, of course, win $1 billion, a multi-million dollars, and then suddenly now you are wealthy. And wealth in the United States gives you clout and power. It's not the only thing, but it's a very important thing. Now here, by basing this upon wealth, you didn't think I'd ever get back to the topic, did you? By basing it on wealth, we can reduce the power of the patricians. Why? Because the patricians had what we might call old money. Some of them were losing money, and some of the plebeians were actually gaining money. So a wealthy plebeian then could begin to have some input. This is called the Comitia Centurion, from the same word we use for century, and so therefore you voted per century or per every 100 people. Now this is an interesting chart. I don't know how much I will talk about it, but I think visually, some people learned visually. But you can see here the Comitia Centuria, 1 vote per century, met outside the city, and so on. These things change over time. I think I'll just bypass this, but you can pause it here if you want to study it more carefully. Just hit the pause button. You can look at it there. Hopefully it's clear on your screen. But this system of committees was very important. Now, as far as wealth goes, it also had something to do in the Republic with your status in the military and in the government. So, for example, I'm sure you've heard, since all of you are avid biblical scholars, of centurions. Centurions, the Roman centurion, right? Mentioned in the Gospels. There's several of them mentioned, 4 or 5 of them mentioned in the Gospels. These were professional soldiers, but they get their name centurion because roughly they were in charge of 100 soldiers. Okay. Now, where do we get the name for some of these groups? One of the political and also sort of economic groups, social groups in the Roman Republic was the equestrian class. How do we get that name? Well, as you can see here, on horseback, right? Equestrian comes from the word for horse, equus in Latin. So equestrian class mainly meant, at least originally meant, that you could outfit a horse. This was mostly rich plebeians. To outfit a horse is not cheap. Even today, it's still quite expensive just to even have a horse. Even if you buy an old beat up horse, it's going to cost you several $100s. Then you're going to have to feed it and keep it somewhere. You're going to have a place for it to stay, get out of the weather. And then if you want to ride it, you're going to have saddles, and reins, and bits, and so on. You're going to have to groom it and exercise it, and medical care. So, having a horse could be quite expensive. I just have Chihuahuas, and that sometimes gets expensive too. They have to have shots and various things. Go see the vet, who always wants to do stuff to them. Well, it's expensive to have a horse. And of course, if you're going to go into battle on a horse, you've got to have your weapons as well. Now, this might be something that you don't realize, but during the American Civil War, the main difference between somebody who was going into the infantry and somebody who was going into the cavalry was their wealth. If you're going into the cavalry unit, you had to bring your own horse. You had to bring your own salad. Had to bring your own saddle. You had to feed your horse and maintain your horse yourself. You had to have all your own weapons and so forth for you and the outfit for your horse. So that's why those units were not very large. We expect typically, I suppose, when we go into the military is going to provide for us everything that we need. At least, a uniform. If they want us to have a rifle, they'll give us a rifle. If they want to fly us to Afghanistan, they will take us to Afghanistan. We don't fly ourselves. The Romans had a different system, though. You went into the military in part based upon your wealth. And it's sort of like the American Civil War. Well, at any rate, that ability to do that was then translated into a class of people called the equestrian class. There was also the first class. These were made up mostly of patricians, wealthy patricians. And then the infantry, so you had the equestrian class, the first class, and then the infantry, that is, these are the foot soldiers, who could not outfit themselves, were also then based upon wealth, second, third, fourth, and fifth classes. Now, when this is translated over into a political realm, the voting would begin with the equestrians and proceed to the first class, and then on down. So that means if you were in the third, fourth, or fifth class, you probably didn't get much of a say in these things. Let's talk about some of the plebeian reforms, as we can see that equestrian class helped them. In the first half of the 5th century, okay, so remember that's in the 400s, there are struggles to have reforms. And some of the things that the plebeians were able to gain, number one, the formation of a new office of tribune, as we've already mentioned, was only for the plebeians. By 450, roughly, that's little c means circa, another Latin means round or about, where we get our word for circle, or circus, which is really a circus is a circle, right? 3-ring circus, 3 circles. Circa 450 means about 450. A new law, new constitutional laws in the new constitution said all the laws must be written. Prior to this, all laws were oral. Now, what do I mean? Well, when we think of laws, we think of stuff that's written down. Roman laws were not written down, but after 450, they must be written down. Why is this an advantage for the plebeians? Basically, even a harsh law that's written down is better for the poor person than having no laws written down. Basically, the law becomes a restraint. The law is a restraint on what someone can do to me. If I'm a poor guy, which I am, what can the wealthy do to me? a written law at least sets some limits. Even if I say, well, that's a terrible law, that's not a fair law, that's, well, true. But guess what? Having a law is better than having no law. Having no law means you can do whatever you want to me. Beat me up, kill me, whatever. The law might say, well, we're going to do this terrible thing to you, but that's basically saying that's all you can do to me. That's the most you can do to me. See? Well, so that was good for them. Then a new assembly is formed called the Plebian Assembly. Again, not binding at this point on anyone, but it gave them a way to organize, a way to strategize, a way to voice their concerns, and allowed them then to vote by tribe within the plebeians, the ranks of the plebeians. Again, this was not binding on the patricians. So perhaps symbolic at first, but it leads to other things. So let's take a look at a few of these Roman laws. Again, around 450, that's when these laws get written down. Of course, according to the new constitution, they must be written down. These are the 12 tables. 12 tables then have the distinction of being the very first written law for the Romans. Now, in this, basically what you're going to do is take what had always been the unwritten laws on, you might call them social custom and so forth, and you write them down. As I said, it was prohibited from a plebeian and a patrician to get married. This is actually written down here in 450. It doesn't mean that it first started in 450. It was already, this is what everybody did or didn't do. And now it's written down. Okay. Another thing that was allowed was debt slavery. Debt slavery. That means that you could sell yourself into slavery by your debt. Okay. I suppose a little different than being born into slavery. And this kind of debt slavery, theoretically, you could get out of it by paying your debts. But as any of you know who have multiple credit cards and maybe student loans and who knows what else, it's very difficult to get out of debt. Okay? And what this actually allowed you to do is say, well, I will sort of sell myself into your service for, say, 7 years to pay for a debt. Okay? Yeah. We call that graduate school now. Graduate school. If you guys think undergrad stuff will put you in debt, go to graduate school. I was in graduate school for a long time. And you become a graduate assistant, they call it. Graduate assistant. It sounds it sounds not too bad. But in fact, the graduate student takes vows very similar to those of the monk. Certainly poverty and humility are chief amongst them. Celibacy, however, is not always followed. Anyway, but the poverty, the humility, and the obedience, those three. If you're a graduate student, you must practice those three disciplines. And poverty will stay with you. Do you guys know that I was reading the other day and I found that student loans are mentioned in the Bible. Did you know that? Student loans are mentioned in the Bible. You may not believe me, but you can look it up. Jesus said, speaking of student loans, "Lo, they are with you always, even unto the end of the age." So keep that in mind. It's very biblical. Well, we also see written down this pater familias thing that we talked about before, that the power of the father has life or death over the family, the pater familias. So these are all things that were there. These are all things that were there. They were called the tables because they were in fact written at first on wooden tables or tablets in the front of the forum, and then of course later on chiseled into stone. These laws begin to change things. Now, notice we said that it was just written in 450, that it was against the law for plebeians and patricians to get married. Not that it started then, but they wrote it down then. Very quickly then thereafter, 5 years later, this law is repealed. This is called the Licinian marriage law, 450 BC. That says repels. It actually should be repeals. Interesting. Can we change this on the fly? Maybe we can. I guess it'll bother me if I don't. See if it works. Well, that didn't do it, did it? There we go. You should probably never do that. So if you're ever doing this, don't do that. But anyway, it repeals the anti-marriage law between the plebeians and patricians. Why? Why now? Why change it? After, it served us well for hundreds of years. Why should we change it? I remember I worked at a very small college once, not in Kentucky. And anytime I would ask about, we did this, have we ever thought about doing this? Have we ever thought about doing that? Anytime I sort of hinted around that maybe we should think about changing something, the answer that I got from them was, it has served us well. I believe they said at the time for 46 years. And basically, the idea was it's going to keep serving us well now, forever. Well, why did it change? It changed because of money. I suppose I'll put it very bluntly. The plebeians were getting wealthy, and the patricians were getting poorer. And the patricians wanted to get the plebeian money, and the plebeians wanted to get the patrician titles, clout. So these crazy kids decided to get married and combine their titles with their wealth. Okay, because patricians really did not want to get involved in business. Business was kind of a dirty business, dirty thing we didn't want to do. So the plebeians got involved in a lot of business ventures. They made a lot of money. And so, for example, you've got a rich plebeian who's got a lovely daughter, and he wants to see his daughter have a better life and his grandchildren to have a better life. And so what we see here is that he arranges for his lovely daughter to marry the son of a patrician. Thereby, the grandchildren, the children of this marriage, would be patricians, but they would also have the wealth of the plebeians. Now, after you do this a few times, 2-3 generations, it sort of gets to be hard to determine anymore now who are the patricians and who are the plebeians by birth. And that's how this begins to break down. Once this marriage law, Licinian marriage law comes into place, it breaks this down. It begins to change things. I would say that, maybe almost more than anything else, begins to remove the barrier for the plebeians. So it allows, and of course, why would the patricians go for it? They want the money. Plebeians had a lot of money. Patricians, many of them were losing their money. They didn't want to lose their clout. Licinian Sextian Law of 367. Okay, this law decreed that at least one of the two consuls must be a plebeian. Now that's interesting. But of course, by 367, you're going to have more people who can now begin to claim that they're both sort of patrician and they're plebeian. So they can get the office of tribune, and they can also be the office of consul. It's sort of gives them a double chance at some of this. Anyway, they also passed a law, this law in 367, said that interest would count as payment on the principal. Imagine if we could get that passed. Wow. I guess nobody would want to loan us money anymore. Well, let's say you bought a house for $100,000, and they charge you interest. Of course, interest rates are pretty low right now, 3-4%. But every month, let's say, take a look at your credit cards. Your credit card's interest rate are outrageous. Could be 18% interest, maybe more, depending on what credit card you have. Hopefully you don't have many, certainly not with that high interest rate. Let's say you bought something, you know, some fancy TV for your house or computer or something. You spend $1,000. You take it home, you start to enjoy it. Then you start getting the bill. You're going to get the bill, and the bill's going to say, oh, give us $20, give us $30. Now, of course, that amount has gone up recently. There's been legislation which has been passed. It says the minimum payment must be, more than just the interest. But if you take a look, you'll see that if you pay the minimum payment, even now on credit cards, they often have to put it on there now. It might take you 20 years to pay off this TV, and you will pay double what it cost you. Anyway, imagine if your interest would count as your principal. Soon after this, debt slavery is abolished as well. Well, here's another law, Hortension Law, 287. The Hortension Law said that the measures passed by the plebeian assembly are binding on all Romans. And this was sort of one of the final legislative things. It now says this plebeian assembly is binding on all Romans. Now, of course, there's going to be other things that will happen later. It's not going to remove all of the differences, but this is the path, legislative path, to the change. Well, I've maybe gone too long on this one, but we're going to end it here for right now. Have a good day.